Yo, what's up guys, it's Talon. Today we're bringing you a full meta report where I'm going to talk about every single role, what champions are best, what types of champions are best, the counters those champions, everything like that. Keep in mind, this is not a tier list. I'm not ranking these champions in tiers, and I'm not going to talk about every single champion in the game, because to me, that's a waste of time. I want you guys to understand what is strong, why it's strong, and what you can potentially play if you want to find other things to play into that. If you're curious about your favorite champion, just ask me in the comments if I don't mention them, and I'm happy to answer questions about how I feel about any champion and their current place in the meta. So going on to top lane, overall, kind of the theme of top laners is true damage bruisers are really just the strongest champions in the game right now overall. So the two strongest top laners, and it's really hard for me to choose which one I think is better, are Darius and Camille. The reason Darius is so strong is because in the durability patch, he has really good sustained damage. He's really good in these longer fights, and he has true damage, of course, on his ultimate and with his bleeding on his stacks. And so he's going to melt through these tanks, which have become so prevalent in so many different roles. Everyone's tankier, and so having these champions with really good sustained damage, true damage, everything like that, just super, super strong. Now, for a similar reason, Camille is equally as strong. Camille's laning phase sometimes is a little less scary than Darius, who can run you down and really kill you very early on. But the later on into the game you go, the more powerful Camille becomes. He has amazing side lane pressure, which is even more valuable because there's not always those hex gates as early on in the game as before, being, as big of a menace where they can teleport across the map. Now it's a bit different where they're placed, and that overall makes Camille better as well. And again, her true damage and her sustained damage is extremely strong. She's a really consistent laner who really doesn't lose any lanes. Even if she doesn't win every lane, she really doesn't lose any either. She's overall extremely strong. And then Renekton is going to be one of the sort of outliers where he's just really strong because he does well in all of these lane matchups. He's good into Darius. He's really, really good into Camille, probably one of the best champions to pick into Camille. So he's just going to be consistent in these lanes. He's going to always be able to get out of these lanes ahead and kind of get his team an early advantage and still be really tanky later on in the game. So he's still going to be extremely solid, but a little bit below Darius and Camille. After that, we have Warwick simply for his lane phase. Warwick is not on the same level of these other champs later on in the game, and he's a bit more of a unique champion to play, requires a bit of a different type of play style. But he's so dang strong in lane phase and doesn't lose lane to literally anybody in the entire game. And for that reason, I think it's really important to mention, anytime that you need to get ahead in lane and you need that early game strength, Warwick is going to be a god tier top laner for that. Now, next up, we have, in my opinion, the most underrated champion probably in the entire game, and that's Nasus. I think Nasus is genuinely insane right now in the meta. Not only is he able to survive most of these matchups pretty well, like even champions like Darius and Camille he'll struggle into, but he can survive them. So those are obviously going to be hard matchups for him. And then most of the other laners don't actually have the damage to kill him. And then he's going to scale insanely well. He's just able to pretty much win against everyone on the side lane later on in the game. He becomes a complete beast. His damage is insane. His kit as a whole is just a nutty kit. So overall, Nasus is very, very good. Then we have Sett, and again, Sett has true damage. He's a really tanky top laner, a good bruiser. Similar reasons to the Darius or the Camille example. He's going to be very strong for those reasons as well. Then we have Garen, another true damage champion with good laning, good sustain, also very strong. He's a bit better in split pushing than Sett, but a bit worse in team fights than Sett. After that, we have Gwen, who's just going to be a solid tank counter. So if you ever want to counter tanks, locking in Gwen's going to be nice. More of a counter pick, not really a blind pick. Then we have Olaf, and Olaf is really good into a lot of the meta right now as well, because his ultimate obviously you have to hit someone to keep it up. And so all of these melee champions who like to spend long times fighting, Darius does amazing into those, Olaf rather, does amazing into those types of champions. And so he's a really good counter pick anytime you see a champion who's easy to stick onto, basically. Then we have Kayle. I just mentioned Kayle here because anytime you see an easy matchup, locking in Kayle is going to be really good for the rest of the game. So if you have an easy top lane matchup, lock in Kayle. I don't think it's necessarily strong most games, but anytime you see a free matchup, you lock in Kayle, you're going to melt through tanks later on in the game, so that's why I wanted to mention it. Yone, to me, very similar to Kayle. Obviously a better early lane, but not quite as powerful in the later stages of the game, but a similar thing where you're going to counterpick when you see an easy lane matchup. After that, Mord and Gragas, to me, are the best AP champions, apart from Warwick. So Warwick, even when you build AD, he does a lot of AP, so he's kind of AP anyways, but both Mordekaiser and Gragas, they're extremely strong AP champions as well right now. So if you ever need an AP top laner, definitely go to one of those. I'm just going to mention Rumble because he's a newer champion, but in my opinion, Rumble is pretty underwhelming right now. He doesn't really feel like he fits the meta too well. His damage is just not that high. His lane phase is decent, but doesn't feel like he can necessarily stomp these lane phases. So overall, I don't really recommend Rumble as a whole. Range tops in general, not really the best right now either, because a lot of these tankier champions and bruisers can survive them fine and then just outscale on the side lane. Vayne, however, can definitely counterpick some of these tanks. Then we're going to have some great tank options like Ornn and Maokai, and just most of the tanks. Like even you can lock in stuff like Amumu, stuff like Mundo if you want. All these different tank options, they're going to do decent. The only problem is they're going to struggle a little bit into these true damage champions that are really strong, which is why I didn't put them at the top. But overall, that's kind of going to do it for top lane. Again, if you really just want to keep one theme in mind, keep in mind that any champion that has true damage, especially if they're a bruiser, is probably going to be solid right now in the top lane. Okay, now moving on to the jungle. The overall theme of jungle, or the best types of champions right now, are tanky champions that have good CC and sustained damage. And no champion does that better right now than Amumu, and that is exactly why he is definitely the #1 champion, not only in jungle, but in the entire game. Alongside all of that, not only does he have build diversity, where he can build both AP and tank, whatever your team needs, but he also has an absurdly fast clear speed. If you're really good at the clear, you can do it in 1 minute and 17 seconds. If you do it poorly like I do, you can do it at about 1:27, which is still absurdly fast for a full clear. He has great CC, great engage, great sustain, good damage, can kill Baron in 10 seconds. Like I said, the clear speed, basically everything about him is just absurdly OP. After that, we have Vi. Vi also has a really, really nice clear speed, amazing ganking potential, even better ganking than Amumu has early on in the game. Great engage. The only thing that she really falls short on is that she's a bit more single target in comparison to Amumu, hence why she's not quite as strong, but she still pairs amazingly with many of the meta mid laners, and she just overall makes it really easy for your team to get through the early game and has great engage later on. Then we have Nilah. Nilah's genuinely broken right now. Her damage is extremely OP. She's a bit different than the other meta junglers because she's not as strong in the early parts of the game in comparison to a lot of these tankier junglers. But once you get onto 3 items as Nilah, you're going to completely shred through the entire enemy team. You're going to melt tanks. You're going to melt squishies. Everyone's going to die to you. As long as you know how to farm efficiently, you're going to do extremely well on this champion. It's just that simple. Then Shyvana is pretty similar to Nilah, but obviously a lot tankier. So Shyvana is pretty much the tanky version of Nilah, where she can still melt tanks really well, but she's going to have a lot more tankiness, a lot more sustain. Probably not as easy to punish in the early game compared to Nilah, but Nilah's, overall strength, when you get to those later parts of the game, is going to be much higher. Ambessa, after the nerfs, still really, really solid as well, but to me fell down compared to, before she was as strong as, I would say, Vi. Now Ambessa's probably, if we're doing tiers, at a tier below Vi, because Ambessa still has that good sustain, the good damage, pretty much everything you would want in jungle, but obviously just getting those nerfs made her not quite as strong or scary as before. Now Rammus is pretty much like the Malphite of jungle, so I actually forgot to mention Malphite for the top lane, so I'll mention it right now. But Malphite is a great counter pick anytime you see an AD, top laner, and then a bunch of AD alongside it. So if there's just a bunch of AD on the enemy team, Malphite's really good. And Rammus is the exact same. Rammus is obviously just, way better at stacking armor, way better into heavy AD comps. And so anytime the enemy pick 4 or 5 AD, Rammus is a god tier counter pick, but I don't recommend blind picking him or one-tricking him. Then after that, we have Maokai, who's just a solid tank. Again, tanks right now, champions that have good CC and sustained damage and can just survive all those types of things are going to be strong. And so for that exact reason, he's going to be quite good right now. But he's just not as solid as some of the other champs, such as Amumu and these other tanks, but definitely a good champion. Now, Red Kayn is going to be better than most bruisers. The reason that Red Kayn's better than most bruisers is because he has more sustain with all that healing, and so he can survive a lot longer onto these tanks, whereas a lot of other bruisers kind of just get shut down by all that CC from these tanks. And so for that reason, one of the decent bruisers right now that's a bit underrated is definitely going to be Red Kayn overall. Now, one of the best counters to the entire jungle meta is Morgana. Morgana not only has the Black Shield, which of course prevents all of these champions with a bunch of CC from doing really anything, but she absolutely shreds through tanks in the mid to late game, and that's exactly, again, what you need to counter these junglers. And so, in my opinion, Morgana is really one of the best junglers in the game just because of how well she does into the entire meta. And so I recommend maybe picking her up as a counter pick, especially if you need an AP jungler. Now, Lilia is the exact same as Morgana, just melee and faster and a deer. But Lilia overall, again, true damage, AP, which is a good damage type if you ever have an AD mid laner especially. She just completely shreds through anyone once she gets to 2 items, and these tanks are not going to stand a chance against her. So she's similarly really good at countering the meta, but Morgana has that Black Shield, which to me makes it a bit of a better counter in some ways, but Lilia's overall damage to these tanks is a lot higher, which means you have higher carry potential, which is why Lilia is so dang strong as well. If you are needing an assassin, because assassins did not completely fall out of the meta, guys. Assassins still do have their place in the meta whenever the enemy do pick some squishy champions. or when you already have a lot of tanks in your team and you need that burst damage to burst down the backline. And there's going to be no better assassin jungle right now than Echo, in my opinion. He has pretty solid clear speed. He has really good scaling, really good burst damage, and is overall still a really strong champion. And he's very safe. He still even does well into a lot of these tankier champions, so you're not going to struggle into the tanks too much either. So he's just overall a really solid pick as a whole. Gragas is going to be a really nice AP option as well. He's good into tanks. He's good into squishies. He pretty much does well in every type of situation as well. So definitely a good AP option. Olaf is very underrated. We already described why in top lane, but he does the same thing in jungle. And probably even better because you get access to a lot more gold in jungle, and you have the blue buff, so you can spam your first ability a lot more. Then most of the AD assassins kind of fell off. The champions like Lee Sin, Riven, Zed, Talon, Rengar, all these AD assassins that you're thinking of, or bruisers, they all fell off a lot compared to their previous strength. However, they're not useless. Specifically, Lee and Riven, they are still good in most scenarios just because they're really strong champions. Their early game is still really good. They're really good at skirmishing early game. You just have to be really on top of things in the early game and you know, really find great opportunities to snowball. And you're not going to, you know, have as much leeway in the late parts of the game if you don't get that early lead, which is why they're a bit weaker. But then for those other champions like, you know, Zed and Talon and Rengar, they're significantly weaker because a lot of tankier champions are being picked. So they're really not able to burst down as many champions, and they just don't feel great right now in the meta. I will say, however, if you have an AP mid laner, you can lock in these AD junglers, especially if you already have a tank in the top side or a tank in support who has that engaged potential for you, and they're going to be able to set you up, and you'll still be able to one-shot the squishies and do your thing. So by no means are they weak right now. They're just not as strong as some of these other champions we mentioned. But if you're like really good at those types of champions, that's still going to work for you. Just might be, you know, a bit more effort than you previously had to put in. But overall, that is the main thing about jungle. Again, tanky champions with a lot of CC and sustained damage are really, really good right now, making a lot of champions who have good true damage or good tank bursting also really good in the jungle. And right before we go into mid lane, guys, just let me know what you think about this format where I'm talking a bit more extensively about the meta rather than having it be like a 10 to 15 minute video. This one's going to be a bit longer. And just let me know if you like me breaking down the meta more in depth like this, or if you prefer if it's more of an overview in the future. Anyways, going on to mid lane, Syndra is by far the best mid laner in the game. She is absurdly broken, extremely good burst damage, really good like sustained damage as well, really good at melting tanks, still really good into squishies, really doesn't have many weaknesses. She's strong in the lane phase. Just a broken champion as a whole right now in the mid lane. Now, Orianna and Victor are going to be very similar to Syndra, just worse versions of her, essentially. I would say that Victor is going to have that 1v9 potential because of his ultimate, you know, building up when you get kills and all that type of stuff. And he's still a really strong champion, and he does really well in lane, and he's a pretty good laner into Syndra. Orianna is going to have absurd scaling that can also just literally one-shot a squishy at any time, and her scaling's really good. So overall, Orianna and Victor are just going to be a little bit worse than Syndra, but they're going to do very similar things. They're going to function very similarly. Overall, mid lane, just consistent mages are really what is really strong right now. Now, because consistent mages are really strong, Kassadin's really strong. He's always a good counter pick into these mages. He's going to one-shot them later on in the game. He's going to be able to survive the lane with his magic shield. So just overall, Kassadin is really solid because he counters the meta, so I recommend him as more of a counter pick. Now, Echo is going to be overall the best assassin mid, though, in scenarios, you know, other than into just these AP champions. So Echo is probably the best champion into Syndra that you could pick right now. So if you're looking for a counter pick specifically into that, Echo's great for that. Echo does well into most of the mages, and he also does really well into pretty much any type of champion because he has such good wave clear that even if the lane phase isn't optimal for you or it's not a good matchup, you can simply just get out of the lane really simply by constantly just spamming your first ability on the wave and melting that wave. So you're always going to have value as Echo, and of course your scaling is going to be really strong. So he's just going to be a very, very solid mid laner still. Lissandra is going to be a good counter pick into Assassins, as she always is. Assassins aren't the strongest right now, but if you see something like Echo locked in, Lissandra is going to perfectly counter that. Then we have Diana, who I just don't think is that good right now. She's kind of a worse version of Echo, a worse version of Kassadin right now in the mid lane. Don't really recommend her, but if you're really good at her, you can still make her work because she still will do the same thing she did before, just, you know, to a lesser degree because of the nerfs and because of the durability patch and all those types of things. Morgana, Aesol, and Brand are all going to be similar tank counters. So when you see a very tanky comp on the enemy team, if they lock in a Rammus, they lock in a Malphite, they lock in, you know, one of these tanky champions, all of these champions are going to be really good. I would say Morgana is the best for the same reason we mentioned her in the jungle. But Aesol is really good at melting tanks and scales absurdly well. If you get on 3 items as him and you have your big ultimate, you can literally 1v9 a fight. Brand is a bit underrated right now. Most people don't play him, but he obviously melts tanks really, really well as well. So if you're looking for any tank counters, Morgana, Aesol, Brand, all really good. Corki is going to be one of the most consistent champions that you could lock in every single game and never be mad about. He has a solid lane phase. He scales really well. He has good poke, and he can still do really well into tanks and melt them as well. He pretty much has no weaknesses. So I definitely recommend him if you're looking for a consistent champion. Swain can be a good counter pick right now if the enemy are really heavy melee. So if they're like 4 melee champions, 3 melee champions, and you're laning a melee champion, you can really just kite people around really well. You can keep your ult on, multiple people at a time, sustain really well, and have just good damage. So he's going to be a good counter pick in situations like that. Galio's going to do well into any AP assassin, of course. Galio's going to do pretty well into the mages as well. Not as well, but still decent. And he's always a good supportive champion who can just find value in pretty much any game, especially with a lot of the AP champions that are running rampant right now. After that, Katarina, pretty much just a squishy. If they're squishy, then you can counterpick Kat and do it. But obviously, they got to not have very much CC. However, Cleanse does kind of make it nice because if the enemy do have a lot of CC, you can take the Cleanse and kind of get around it. So if you're a good Katarina player, you can make it work for sure. Ziggs is just going to be consistent, but he's a bit worse than a lot of the other mages I mentioned because he's not as insane into tanks. He more prefers one-shotting squishy champions, but he's still consistent. He's still good. You can build Leandries to alleviate that weakness a bit. Ahri, Zoe, and Annie are all kind of burst mages that don't do as well into tanks. So they're not the best for that, but they're really good at following up on a good jungler. So if you have a jungle champion like Vi, like a Mumu, these champions, they can all follow up on that CC really well and burst down their laners and get advantages that way. So I still think they're solid champs, but they require a bit more synergy oftentimes with your jungle. And then AD champions, you can lock in when you have an AP jungle. It's pretty much that simple. Some of the best laning AD champions are going to be champs like Jace, Akshan, and Lucian. And then some more like assassin type of champions like Yone, Yasuo, or Zed can work in the mid lane if you do see an angle for an assassin when you have an AP jungle. So overall, consistent mages in the mid lane are definitely taking over as a whole, and that's pretty much going to be the mid lane meta. Okay guys, so now we're going to go into the ADC meta. Kai'Sa is overall just the strongest ADC in the game, bar none, and the reason for Kai'Sa's strength is mostly the fact that she's so good at melting through tanks right now. Her passive makes her really, really good at melting through tanks because of the fact that not only does she do mixed damage, but it melts tanks just as a whole. She has very good consistent damage, and overall consistent damage output right now on ADCs is very strong. Now, Kai'Sa not only has consistent damage output, but she also has really good burst damage. So not only is she going to melt through these tanks, but she's going to do really well into squishies too. And of course, you're usually laning in ADC, right? So obviously having that burst damage to burst down enemy ADC is going to be really good. And then you have a lot of champions in jungle and other roles that are very aggressive and have a lot of CC. So if a Mumu or a Vi engages on the enemy, you can dive in immediately with your ultimate, which most other ADCs can't do. And you have a lot of build diversity. You can abuse items like Runons, but you can also go for crit when the enemy are very squishy. So build diversity, consistent damage, and still having that access to burst damage when you need it makes Kai'Sa overall just super, super broken. Now, Varus is going to be one of the few champions who aren't consistent damage output champion that's still really strong. And that's simply because he has such a strong lane phase, such good poke, and still pretty absurd burst damage that it doesn't really matter that he doesn't necessarily have the most sustained damage. And then his passive still lets him melt through tanks even when you're building the lethality build because of just how much damage you're going to get from those stacks. So Varus, definitely very strong laner and still really good even into these tanks. And definitely just overall very, very OP. And then a couple of the other champions that are just really top tier right now are Xayah and Zeri. So Xayah is really good because Xayah can kite the tanks so well. It's really hard for these tanks to dive onto her and actually get onto her. And she can just constantly damage them really well. Still has good burst damage. And also really good sustained damage into these tanks. And then Zeri specifically works really well because of how many shielding champions are in the meta. So if you don't know, Zeri basically steals people's shields when she does damage to them. Because of this, any champion building Gargoyle, she's immediately going to do well into it. A lot of champions build Gargoyle right now. Champions have shields, like Vi, for example, has shields. Meta ADCs like Kai'Sa have shields. Lulu, the best support in the game, as we'll get onto, has shields. Pretty much everyone who's strong right now, or a lot of them, Orianna, have shields, right? And so for this reason, Zeri is extremely strong. She also synergizes really well with the best supports in the game, as we'll get into as well. So just Zeri, definitely one of the most underrated ACs in the game right now. Corki's going to have solid damage output for the same reason he's a good mid laner. Just going to be consistent. You don't really have any bad situations to pick him in, especially if you need some AP damage in the ADC role. Then you have Vayne, who's actually a solid champion right now. It's been a while since Vayne's been good. But Vayne right now, of course, does really well into tanks, and so I still don't recommend blind picking Vayne. But if you see the enemy pick some tanky champions like Amumu, like Vi, these different things, you can really lock in that Vayne and have a really good time. And Cleanse really helps out Vayne because now you don't have to worry about getting locked down as much if you need. You can take the Cleanse and be really happy about that as well. Sivir is going to be really consistent, can melt through the tanks in the later parts of the game, and get good lane prio early on, even if it's not the strongest laner. Just overall a strong champion as well. Caitlyn is going to be a really good just like poke kind of lane bully. So if you see someone pick something like a Vayne or one of these late game champions, you can lock in the Caitlyn and kind of make their life really hard in the early game, even if you're not going to do as well into the tanks later on. Similarly, Lucian is going to be another really good early game laner who's going to fall off. So to me, Lucian got a lot worse this patch because he's more focused around burst damage and kind of struggles when these champions have a lot of really like tankiness that he can't just melt through. But he does similarly do really well, especially with certain supports like Nami, for example, at just completely dominating lane and kind of making these late game scaling champions struggle a lot. So he can be good in those scenarios. Jhin right now, I'm not really a fan of him. He has fine wave clear. He's consistent enough, but he just doesn't do that much into the tanks. He just feels pretty bad overall. Ashe also feels pretty bad. I'm not really a fan of Ashe in this meta. Just not very great output, damage output compared to the average champion, but she has a decent lane phase. Ezreal, his damage output feels a little lacking if you're not hitting really, really consistent skill shots. So if you're not a really good Ezreal, just don't lock it in right now. But if you're solid on the champion, you can make him work still in the meta. Jinx and Tristana, they both have decent sustained damage, so they're not bad right now, but they just don't feel as strong as these other scaling champions. They don't specifically melt through tanks. Their lane phases aren't the strongest necessarily, so they're just not the best right now in the meta. Samira, pretty bad because she just doesn't really do well into all of the CC, all of the tanky champions. She prefers having engaged champions engaging for her into squishier champions and kind of one-shotting them, and you just can't really do that well in this meta. Kalista, in my opinion, probably the worst ADC in the game. She's just pretty useless right now. She can lane fine, but after lane phase, completely useless, and she's not even the best lane bully that there is. There's many better lane bullies. Then Miss Fortune, I would say, is one of the good champions as a lane bully, but only really either into bad players or when you have really good CC and setup for you. So in low elo, they don't really play well around her bounce. So if they're not playing well around her bounce, then you can definitely lock her in pretty much any situation in low elo. But in the higher elos, she really more synergizes with champions like Leona and Nautilus, who can set up her ultimate really nicely. So if you have that type of support on your team, she's going to be solid. Draven, not really good right now, but you can obviously always snowball with Draven. So if you have an aggressive support and you guys stomp lane, you can still carry on him, but otherwise, probably going to struggle. And then Twitch pretty much just works for melting tanks when he has certain supports like Melio, Lulu, or Yuumi, but otherwise is not going to be the best. So overall, consistent damage output, definitely the best thing for most ADCs right now. And obviously we went into more detail there, but that's overall the ADC meta. And lastly, we have support, and I think support is the most important role to make the distinction between solo and duo queue, because it's a very different type of meta, depending on whether or not you can coordinate with your ADC. So starting off with some of the best duo queue champions and some of the best supports overall, to me, Lulu and Melio still dominate the meta. They buff an ADC, any hyper carry, sustained damage ADC so well, and so when those champions are really strong, the champions like the Zeris, the Zayas, the Kaisas, if you have a champion who's buffing that damage output even more, either with Melio giving a lot more range or Lulu giving that additional attack speed, they're just going to be absurdly broken. But obviously, if you're solo queue, you can't really coordinate as well. And so if you're looking for some solo queue champions, overall, engaged supports like Nautilus and Thresh are going to do super well for setting up your teammates in solo queue, because you can really dictate the pace of the game. You can control your teammates' actions more when you make the engages and stuff like that, compared to playing these other enchanters. Now, if you're looking for other solo queue champions, but you like enchanters, the best solo queue enchanters are going to be champions like Nami and Karma, because they have really strong lane phases and can overall make more engages, make more plays, and just have overall higher damage. Janna similarly has kind of a lot of those similar characteristics, just a little worse. And Seraphine has amazing playmaking potential, even from the enchanter role, and decent damage. So if you're looking for any type of solo queue enchanter, any of those four, Nami, Karma, Janna, or Seraphine, they're all going to work out well. Ornn, in my opinion, is a pretty underrated tank as well. He's good for solo queue and duo queue. He has really good engage, really good setup. Just a solid champion overall, and kind of outshines most of the other tanks apart from Thresh and Nautilus, in my opinion. Then after that, I would say that Braum is a really solid champion too, especially when he's duo with any champions who can proc his passive easily, like Lucian, Ezreal, those types of champions. But he's overall just good for peeling, good for protecting your carries, and a bit better in duo queue overall. So then for duo queue or solo queue, Soraka, Sona, and Yuumi are all kind of just worse versions of Lulu and Melio. They're all enchanters that buff their team, mostly focus on healing or shielding or buffing them in some way. But they're all just kind of worse than Lulu and Melio as a whole. Blitzcrank is going to be one of the best tank supports in the game if you're really good on him, but he's going to be a lot harder to execute than the other champions I mentioned, like Nautilus and Thresh. So only really play Blitzcrank if you're really confident with him, but if you are confident, he's a solid one. Pyke is pretty much a solo queue champion. I recommend picking Pyke if you're trying to carry solo queue and you feel like you can't do it with the normal types of supports, or if you like playing with the snowballing ADC. So if your friend, you know, is a good, I don't know, Lucian player or Varus or some, you know, aggressive good laning champion, then you can lock in Varus with them in duo queue and you're going to do pretty solid as well. Morgana and Zyra are multiple good tank support counters. Like they can counter any tank really in general. And so if you like a more carry support style and you also want to have something that can melt through tanks, I recommend Morgana or Zyra. Locking in one of those two is definitely a good counter pick option whenever you see a lot of tanks, and they work well in solo queue. Amumu is good in support if you really want to one-trick a champion. So because Amumu is so broken in jungle, obviously learning how to play him there is good. And then if you're a jungle player and you want to just have a champion you can play in a bunch of roles, you can play Amumu top lane, you can play Amumu support, so he can fit into multiple different roles as kind of that tank engage option. And so that's kind of why I recommend picking him, is just because he's going to be so good in so many roles. He's going to be very one-trickable, which is why he's pretty solid in support. And then Leona and Alistar are kind of worse versions of Nautilus and Thresh. They're really tanky, they have good engage, good CC, but they just don't do it as well as those hook champs, mostly because those hook champs have better lane phases. And then Rakan kind of struggles right now, honestly. A lot of these tankier supports will counter him, but if you see the enemy lock in an enchanter and you want someone who can just have good wombo combo engages later in the game, then Rakan can work well in those types of situations. But overall, that's going to do it for the video, guys. That is the meta. I know it was a longer one, and so let me know if you prefer this longer breakdown, or again, if you want shorter breakdown. I'm really down to do either type of style, but I wanted to see how you guys felt about me breaking down pretty much the entire meta. Obviously, I didn't mention every single champion in the game, and so if I didn't mention a champion that you're curious about, just ask me in the comments. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you later.